And joining us now on the debate in Calgary, Alberta, Lisa Young, political scientist at the University of Calgary. And here in studio, Tim Murphy, partner with the law firm Macmillan LLP and former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Jim Harris, former leader of the Green Party of Canada. And Theo Caldwell, National Post columnist and one-time candidate for the Canadian Alliance. Lisa, it's good to have you on the program in Calgary. Don't think we've had you on before, so it's good to meet you for the first time. And gentlemen, nice to have you back in our studio again.
Thank you.
I just want to make sure we're all speaking the same language here as we start. So Lisa, just give us your political science 101 best definition of what we're all talking about when we talk about big tent politics.
Well, I think we're talking about a party that has room in it for people with maybe some differing opinions, not a highly ideological party, but a party that we, in political science terms, call a brokerage party, where the party acts to, in a sense, bring together some disparate interests and find compromises that they can agree on. And
the Liberal Party of Canada, Tim, I think it's fair to say, has been that kind of party for most of its life in this country. How important do you think that is to the electoral success it's had in the past?
I think it's crucial to the electoral success it has. And frankly, I think it's been, when the Conservatives have won majorities, crucial to their electoral success too. I think that, you know, in a regional country like ours, the ability to have an entity bring together disparate interests within one and find compromises within that entity has been an important part of building the country. And the Liberal Party has managed to capture that label, that space for most of the country's history until recently. And I think what we see in the last, depending on how you count it, 15, 20 years, has been a challenge to that by virtue of, I think, the rise of more regionally based parties. And that has been a significant challenge to our political establishment, if I can put it that way.
When you ran 10 years ago, Conservatives were not in a big tent. They were in a few tents, actually, at least two, maybe more.
Yeah.
Happier times now that they're all in one big red tent, or big blue tent, I guess it is. Sorry about that.
Well, what's left of that party I ran for one time, its former leader, not when I ran, but its former leader is now Prime Minister of the country, albeit with a couple of minority governments. Yeah, there were lots of tents 10 years ago and a couple of teepees off to the side. Everyone was doing their own thing. But if I can amplify the definition that the professor gave, very apt definition, it's not just a philosophical thing we're discussing, we're talking in practical terms as well. And if you want to have a big tent party, it's not just people who have different views, it's what does that translate to? Can you get yourself elected? I'm sure we're going to get into that, but can you get to a majority in this country? Can you get enough people to support you that the philosophical breadth of views that you have actually translates to something that looks like a government? So I'd say it's not just philosophical, as the professor quite aptly pointed out, but I think it's also a practical question we're asking. Can you get a big enough tent to form a majority government in this country?
We are going to get there, but I first want to find out about the size of the tent that Mr. Harris's party represents. Your tie are your politics these days. You're still a Green, right?
Still a Green,
Even
yes.
though you're not the leader of the party anymore. You were the predecessor to Elizabeth May.
Yes.
How big a tent is the Green Party?
Well, you know, in the polls, anywhere from 7 to 14%, but underneath that, what you see is another 20% of Canadians who have us as their second choice, and another 20% who are considering. So we're on the menu for more than 40% of voters in Canada. So it is a substantial segment. And I don't think the genie's ever going to go back in the bottle.
What does that mean?
Well, that means the Bloc isn't ever going to go back into a big tent, and the Greens aren't ever going to go into a big tent, and I don't think the NDP is ever going to go into a big tent, whatever it might be. I was a progressive conservative, and so I'm not going to go back to the Liberal Party because I never was there. And I'm not going to go back to the Conservative Party because it doesn't represent the social values. I was a red Tory that I espouse. And so there's no big tent for me to go back to.
Lisa, does that... Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, but the Green Party is actually a different entity in this. It is not a... It's not a tent in any traditional sense. We're talking about it philosophically because it actually has a policy unity overlaying it, which is you know, a focus on the environment, everything deriving from the environment. But fundamentally underneath that, I mean, I think one of the problems you see in terms of the battles it has over its leadership is actually ideological differences in various parts of the spectrum on issues unrelated to the environmental. And so it's not in that sense a big tent party in the way we're philosophically discussing it. And I agree with you that we'll get, you know, practicality is fundamentally, I think, what drives big tents in this country, because without it you don't win majorities.
Let me just go back to Jim. Would you agree with the way he's analyzed that?
Actually, no, because the Greens are more fiscally conservative than the parties on the right. We wouldn't have subsidized GM. We wouldn't be giving $2 billion a year to subsidize oil and gas interests. So we're more fiscally responsible or conservative than the parties on the right.
But he's saying the philosophy that overlays all of what you are is not the same as that.
What I heard Tim say was, the spectrum issue kind of falls out a different way. Well, the Greens are more fiscally conservative than parties of the right, but we're more socially progressive than parties of the left, because we talk about having a guaranteed annual income supplement, so more than 1 million children don't live in poverty in Canada. So this left-right analysis doesn't work for the Greens, because we're both left and right, and we say we're out in front.
But I'm not sure he's making a left-right point, unless I'm reading you wrong. I think he's making a different point about you guys. In a way, maybe you can help me on this, your tents are about winning. They're about putting together, as Lisa put it, brokerage politics, put enough people in that big tent that you can win.
Yeah.
You don't think that's possible the way they're doing it?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, well, let me rephrase that. I actually think that there are two purposes to the Big Tent, and one of them is about winning, but one of them actually is important, I think, to what has been successful to our country, which is to build a tent within which you can broker regional and disparate interests. And I think, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party have been attempts to do that from different philosophical perspectives. Now, the Alliance was not the same story as that, and I think there was a degree to which they're saying, theirs was a rejection, in a sense, of that big tent politics and more drive towards a philosophical basis for that party. I think the Green Party is more in that sense that kind of party than a big tent party. That doesn't mean, by the way, that in a world where you've got Rob Ford as the leader in the mayoral race here, and you've got the Tea Party phenomenon in the States, that there isn't kind of an anti-establishment populist energy out there that can go in very weird directions.
Let me ask Lisa about the analysis that Jim just put forward, that this genie's out of the bottle, lamp. I wasn't sure which way you put it, so I wanted to check. And in essence, the era of big tent politics is over. We're all getting into smaller tents in this country going forward. What do you think on that, Lisa?
Well, I think there is some evidence for that. I mean, we certainly haven't seen a lot of historical precedents for something like the Green Party that's, getting 7%, 10% of the vote nationally, although not getting any seats. But the Bloc is the real question here. Is the Bloc going to be a permanent fixture in Canadian politics, or will the voters in Quebec eventually come back to one of the traditional brokerage parties? I mean, that's what's really missing from the big blue tent for the Conservatives this time around. Unlike the Mulroney coalition, the Harper Conservatives have the West, they've got conservative parts of Ontario, but they're missing that critical piece of the puzzle, which is Quebec. And it doesn't appear, at least in the short term, that they're going to make any really significant inroads into that.
I guess we have to acknowledge that one of the reasons we're calling this program what we're calling it is because of speeches that Michael Ignatieff has been making over the summer on this Liberal Express he's doing, making this kind of nostalgic pitch to come back into the big red tent, by which he means he wants all those sort of center voters to come home. Well, let him say it. Here we go. Michael, roll tape, please.
Come on in to the big red tent. Come on in to the big red tent at the center of Canadian life. It is time to change this government. It is time to get government we can trust. It is time to have accountable government, fiscally responsible government, socially compassionate government, and there's only one place to come to get it, the big red tent at the center of Canadian life. Thank you.
Now, Theo, as a call to arms, how do you like that?
Well, it's not exactly Henry V, is it? It's not... Well, I hadn't seen that particular clip before. I would be leery about getting into a tent with that guy, particularly just that
be
delivery.
nice. Come on.
I am being nice.
You
That
know
was a very strange clip, Steve. That just seemed weird to me.
In what respect?
I don't know. I know he's tired from the bus trip and a lot of speeches and everything else, but he seemed haggard, and that just seemed like a really strange...
It's a metaphor. He's asking everybody to come home to the Liberal Party.
On paper, I think what he said might have seemed better than what we just saw. What we just saw seemed to me almost desperate. It seemed really... as I say, that struck me as extremely peculiar, but can I just, on the previous point, the professor used the key term that I think is important here, and that is coalition. Coalitions are going to exist in this country.
That's a dirty word in this country now, isn't it?
Well, let me tell you, they're going to exist either within one big tent party, or they will be in the form of a minority government, several different parties, and so we have a series of...
We're going to get there. We're going to get there. Hold off on that. We are going to get there. I appreciate you want to... But I'm really fascinated. Okay, hang on. Tim, I'm going to get to you in a second.
Okay.
Jim, the call to go back into the big red tent. What'd you think?
Yeah, it didn't move me at all for the same
Well, okay.
for the same reasons.
I know.
I think this has been the classic pitch from the Liberal Party over the ages, but it just isn't going to work anymore because those people.
You don't know that. It's a pitch.
I'm giving
We'll
you
see.
my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to work because once people have their own voice, it's hard to convince them to give it up and to now broker the interests they got to express without being moderated. So it's hard, I think, to put the genie back in the bottle for that reason. And what I was saying earlier to Tim is the reason I talked about the left and right split is people exist very comfortably in the Green Party who are former reformers and former NDPers. And that is, by definition of what I think we're talking about, a big tent. If you can welcome someone from the right and left of the spectrum and they happily coexist, that is a big tent.
That's a bigger tent. Lisa, let me get your. I know, Tim, you want to get in, but hang on one second. Lisa, I want to hear from you first on this clarion call for everybody to get back into the big red tent.
Well, first of all, I want to address Jim's point, which is that once people have a voice, they're not going to give it up. But if it's a voice in the wilderness, then they might very well give it up. Having a voice through the Green Party would presumably be more satisfying or more meaningful for voters if the Green Party had any seats. So I'm not sure that we should just dismiss this idea on the grounds that people have voice. It strikes me that in that clip where Michael Ignatieff is calling people back into the big red tent, really what he's trying to do is to, poke at the Prime Minister for being a bit of an ideologue in his view, for being a bit insular. And certainly, when we think back to the political discussion over the summer about the census and so on, I think he might in fact have some traction with people who are centrist voters, maybe even center to a little bit to the right, who might potentially be turned off by this. So I'm not sure that I'm as negative on the big red tent call as some of the others on the panel are.
Maybe better to be in a big red tent than a small green tent.
A small green tent, or even I think what he's trying to say is that the big blue tent, when you go in there, you've got to agree to a bunch of things, including, really taking whatever the leader says and not arguing with it. Okay. And I mean, certainly conservatives would maybe differ with that view, but I do think that he's trying to play off some of the perception about the leadership qualities of Stephen Harper.
I know Tim has been waiting patiently to try to agree with Theo on his interpretation of that clip, so go ahead, Tim.
I'm totally unsurprised by that reaction from a former Alliance candidate. But so putting that aside, I think
that's a bit of a shot.
Well, tit for tat.
He could still be a nice guy. Yeah,
I'm not saying he isn't.
You took a shot, he takes a shot back.
So
okay.
I kind of a shot. You asked me for my opinion, and I hadn't seen the clip, and I just think it looks strange.
You've had your say.
Okay.
Just and I'll come back to you. So I gotta respond to Lisa. I think she's right, which is I do think that there is there's both a practical electoral outreach to the message and also a tone and style outreach to the message, which is to say, look, you got to march to the drum beaten by the Prime Minister inside the blue tent. In ours, we're open to many people and many views, and you can express them and have a say, and we will accommodate them within the party. So it is both about the style of governing and about that electoral appeal to a broad range of interests, and over time that's been the best for the country. So I think it has both of those things. I mean, that's not to underestimate the challenge, because I do agree that when you look at the electoral map, it's tough for anyone to get a majority as long as the bloc is sitting there. I think when you for me, the interesting analysis is this. There was one time since 1984, where against a united right, there's really only been one electoral opportunity where a majority was significantly available to the Liberal Party, and that was pre-sponsorship Paul Martin in the late 03 into 04, where you had Bloc Québécois MPs leaving that party to come to the Liberal Party. When there was an expectation of a significant majority, the sponsorship blew that all away, especially in Quebec. So I think that in the right setting, the opportunity is there. I think the red tent message is fundamentally, though, when you look at where the voters have gone, fundamentally, actually, what's happening is the Conservatives and the Liberals are fighting over about 10% of the electorate. And when that switches to the Conservatives, they're ahead. And when it switches back to the Liberals, they're ahead. And that is fundamentally a centrist community that's looking for a message that says, you know, they liked leadership, and I think Harper initially delivered on that, and so they went to that, and they were fed up with Liberals. And I think now they're kind of saying maybe that kind of leadership isn't what we're looking for, and they haven't decided on the Liberal Party, but I think they're shopping.
You want equal time?
So I don't know. I mean, look. Well, first, let me just clarify. Look, I'm not a partisan guy here. I think I'm the only person. I can't speak for the professor. I think I'm the only person in this discussion who's not a member of a political party in this country.
Me too.
Oh yeah, obviously, except for you. But you know, I have an opinion like anybody else, and I will say this idea of bringing people back into the Liberal tent, it presupposes, and Jim, you touched on this, it presupposes that people were there in the first place. And it is a mindset that is not unique to Canada, and it's not peculiar to the Liberal Party, but I certainly see it there. The idea that they represent what Canadians think, the very center. I'll tell you something, everybody's got an idea where the political center is. I know certainly you do, Steve. You've made a tremendous career out of knowing where the political center is. But the fact is, not everybody shares that view. So the idea that Ignatieff and Liberals in general put across, that their values are completely overlap with those of the country, I think that's a misnomer. I think a lot of people in different parties would agree with me on that, believe it or not.
My hunch is we should go to Calgary, since we're trying to figure out where the political center is, and I bet it's defined differently where you are than it is in Midtown or downtown Toronto. Lisa, fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think that, part of the reason that the Conservatives have been so successful under Stephen Harper is that they've tried to construct sort of a notion of who the typical Canadian is and what it means to be Canadian that's quite different from what we've had from Liberal governments over the past 20 or 30 years. It's not about being rights-bearing, charter-protected citizens so much as it's about being, comfortable middle-class folks who take their kids to hockey with a Tim Hortons coffee in the minivan with them. And I think Harper has had tremendous appeal to those voters, and I think, a lot of them are in that 10% that go back and forth. And so, it has been tremendously successful in a sense, talking about, where the center is and what it is to be Canadian, who these voters are. The question is whether Harper is able to hold on to them while also governing. And, clearly Michael Ignatieff is trying to expand the appeal of the Liberal Party beyond that sort of traditional notion of the liberal conception of the centre and of Canadians. And it's tremendously important for his party that he's able to do that, because we've seen a real diminishment over time of the party's ability to get those voters. And it's part of what's got them on the opposition benches.
Sure. Let me try this with you, Jim. There's nothing permanent in politics, but to the extent that the Bloc Québécois has been around for 20 years now, and they certainly seem to be part of the political landscape for as far as the eye can see, certainly, in the I was going to say in the immediate future, but probably more than the immediate future. Having said all that, does it look like the opportunity to create truly big tents in the way they were when we were all kids, are those days gone?
I really think they are. The Bloc, in essence, blocks any majority government, or makes it the threshold for winning so much higher. And we've seen a dramatic decline in the votes for the only two parties that have historically governed in Canada, the Liberals and the Conservatives. In fact, more people vote for the Bloc, the Greens, and the NDP combined than any of those other two. And in fact, more non-voters than either of those two. And so, when people come to the Greens and say, we want you to merge, we say, yeah, we'll merge with the non-voters. Like, we'll bring the non-voters back into the process, because we bring more people in who are disillusioned with the old line traditional parties than any other party.
But you've said something profound there, Tim, I want to go to you on, which is that if you are in the business, and I know coalition's a dirty word in this country now, but if you are in the business of trying to put together not a coalition inside the big tent, but actually in Parliament, and the Bloc is a fixture that simply is there for as far as the eye can see, is that hamstrung from the get-go now?
Well, it depends on what you mean by coalition. I mean, if a coalition means, A, you're going to have photo ops with the leader of the Bloc Québécois, that's probably a non-starter. But can you govern with votes that involve the Bloc Québécois supporting whatever you do? Yes. I mean, the Conservatives have done it in the time of their government, and the Liberals did when they were in a minority parliament too. So I don't, if you mean by formal coalition, you get so many cabinet seats and that, I think that will have a significant challenge. I mean, You know,
That's
and
not on.
liberals.
That's not on, is
I
it?
don't think it's on. I mean, and liberals have a problem with it more than almost anyone else. I mean, you look at kind of in the 20s in England, right, and you had coalition government there, and it was kind of the death knell of the Liberal Party, from which it has never recovered. And so I think one of the challenges that Dion's proposal had, I mean, obviously Harper did a very good job of demonizing, but liberals actually had a problem with it because they said, what the hell are you doing giving the NDP seats inside the cabinet? I mean, one of the reasons they're held at bay is they don't have legitimacy of governing. And giving them that is a real problem.
Having said that, Theo, you know, there are plenty of countries around the world where coalition governments are, you know, run-of-the-mill standard fare, Israel, I guess, being one of the better examples. And even Westminster-style parliaments. Go to Australia, go to the UK.
Yeah.
They seem to have figured it out without the republic or the monarchy falling apart. So even if it is the Bloc Québécois that it depends on, is that something that ought to be a bigger part of our future here?
I don't think so, and I don't think it will be, quite frankly. There are lots of countries around the world where they have very unstable governments in the sense that they keep having turnover, lots of elections, lots of different coalitions and combinations. I mean, Italy's had, what, 45 different governments since the Second World War. You mentioned UK. Yeah, well, it's the first time I've had a coalition government outside of, you know, tremendous, extraordinary circumstances in quite some time. And the reasons that they end up with this ridiculous situation that nobody's happy about, I don't think, is because David Cameron, who originally, I mean, 2-3 years ago, conservatives were around the world were thrilled about David Cameron, the leader of the Tories in Great Britain. You know, the conservatives in the mountains sang folk songs about him. They thought he was the greatest guy in the world. And you know what ended up happening? He thought he would build himself a big tent by creeping ever leftward. And every time I pick up something to read about him, he's going a bit further. Oh, climate change and National Health Service, and I want to be the new Clement Attlee. And so what he doesn't, maybe, I don't know what he thinks, maybe he thinks he's lucky that he's prime minister and got his coalition. I think if he'd stuck to a real, what got him popular and ahead in the polls in the first place is a real choice, a real conservative choice, I think he would have had the majority government. So I think the UK is an exception. I don't think Canada should or will be one of those countries that has an election every year and a half. Well, the last 5 years would be, obviously, we've had, we might have 4 in 5 years, right? I don't think that's the way of the future. If you get down to it, only 2 parties, nominally at least, have ever run this country. And I think that's our tradition, for better or for worse. And I would be inclined to believe, and I hope that that's the way it's going to remain, because I think that's for the best, for effective government, so you can have, you know, a programming and a vision that goes out a little ways.
Lisa, what about that?
Well, I think that a lot of Canadians fundamentally misunderstand how coalition governments work, particularly in continental Europe. They can be very stable if they're set up in such a way as to be stable. Cabinet posts are shared. It's a very different model of governing, but it's perfectly functional once you accept it. The dilemma in Canada is, first of all, that we're not terribly familiar with it. We tend to associate it with instability, things that we don't particularly want. And now we have the additional dilemma that coalition is associated with something very politically unpopular that from a couple of years ago. But I think the other thing that makes coalitions difficult in Canada is that one of the potential coalition partners is unacceptable to everybody. So if 20% of the seats or 15% of the seats are going to be held by a party that can't play in these coalitions, then it's going to be very difficult to put them together. So I don't think that coalitions are likely to be the way out of this series of minority governments.
Well, let me play contrarian with Jim here just for a second, and that is that, you know, it is happening in Britain, as Theo says, the first time in many, many decades. And it has happened in Australia. And we did flirt with it here for a little while. And there was a good chunk of the population that was not adverse to the idea of putting a coalition together, even if it did depend on bloc support to get rid of the Harper government. Do you sense a greater appetite in this country to go in that direction?
Well,
smaller tents?
It's just a matter of time. As Lisa was saying, the majority of countries in Europe have coalition governments. Germany, which is looked on as a pillar of stability, has had nothing but coalition governments since the Second World War. There's been an occasional one where a party's won an outright majority, but it's very rare. And so coalitions are the way to go. And the advantage is that the parties have their voice beforehand. They argue vigorously for their program. Then after the election, they cooperate and they negotiate a program. And something Tim said upset me, which was saying that it was illegitimate. In fact, our current system is illegitimate because theoretically, with 30% of the vote, you could have absolute power and dominate the legislature and run your programs.
I'm not sure that was his view. I think he was saying that some
he
people
was
thought
saying
that.
Harper demonized
Harper demonized
it.
it.
Harper
right.
demonized
Yeah.
it. Okay. Well, Mr. Harper then, sorry, Tim, I misunderstood you, but Mr. Harper demonized it. But in fact, his government, if it had a majority right now, would not be legitimate because it's a minority of voters, whereas the coalitions actually represent a majority of the voters.
Well, that's interesting. Tim, let me pick up on that because I think, you'll remind me here, Jean Chrétien's third majority government in 2000, I think he won with 37% of the total vote.
40.
That's a pretty small, big red tent, you know.
Yeah, agreed.
So has he got a point here when he says that even if you put the coalition of the opponents together, that actually represents greater legitimacy than one modestly sized red tent with 37% of the total votes?
Well, I guess I don't accept at all the notion that, I mean, that is the result of our system. I don't accept the notion that our system is illegitimate. And in any event, the notion that a coalition of disparate voices that manage to agree on a set of things doesn't necessarily mean that any element of the people who voted for each of those coalitions is going to agree on what the coalitions agree to. So I don't think a fight over, quote, legitimacy about this really is relevant. I actually think that Lisa's onto the right point, which is when one of the most significant players in this is a problem for everyone politically to do a deal with. You're going to have a real problem in putting together a coalition that actually get enough seats. I mean, you know, the Conservatives, when you look at it, they did I think as well as could be done without winning any significant amount of seats in Quebec. And they came this close to the majority, but you know, they had to do extraordinarily well in Ontario, sweep Alberta, do very well in a number of other places. It's very tough, absent Quebec, to have a majority. And the same is true for the Liberals, by the way. I think they're you know, it's tough for me to see in this election anyone getting, you know, probably more than 120 seats. So we're back into this, you know, I think we're actually going to have a period of time where we have elections like this until at some point something breaks it. And it could go in one of two directions. Either the bloc, you know, eventually stops being in the way, or we may splinter and we'll have to go in a German or a European direction.
Splinter even further?
Yeah.
Into what?
Who knows at this point? But I do think there is something weird out there happening when, you know, there is a kind of, all politicians are a kind of establishment, and people who start to articulate that may be able to take advantage of that environment.
Theo.
Well, I just want to add to the point that I made earlier that you yelled at me about, where I went to coalitions before you were ready.
I yelled at you?
I just want to point something
Just
out
like
here.
the things to unroll in order.
I
That's
gotcha.
all.
I know. We can do things orderly here. If you pick the two most successful federal politicians in Canada over the last 25 years, I don't think I'll get huge argument from anybody in this discussion that you'd pick Brian Mulroney and Jean Chrétien. Okay? And in both cases, I think what you saw was a coalition, as I said before everyone climbed on me, about where you had a coalition intra-party. Mulroney certainly did that with the West, which then went on to become the Alliance, which we keep discussing, and obviously Quebec, and we all know how that turned
That
out.
was a shot at you,
And no,
Tim.
it wasn't the shot. I don't want to get into that. But you know, and Chrétien did something similar, which I'm sure you can speak to more aptly than I. So the question is, Germany's a fine example, but that's not our culture, and it is exhausting for people, whoever the party is, to do a minority government in this country. I just think we're better served if we can find the intra-party coalitions rather than splinter up.
He likes the German example because the coalition depends on the Greens.
Sometimes.
The penny drops.
Sometimes it depends.
Let me try this. Let me read this from Maclean's magazine from earlier this year. It's funny. BQ leader Gilles Duceppe told Maclean's magazine, "When we're supporting the Tories, the Liberals are telling the Tories, you're sleeping with the separatists. And when we're supporting the Liberals, the Tories are telling the Liberals, you're sleeping with the separatists. One day I told them, you all want to be in bed with us, but no one wants to marry us."
That was Maclean's. I've taken a turn.
Said Monsieur Duceppe, celebrating his 20th anniversary in Parliament. The guy's been around for 20 years. This party that was supposed to be very temporary. Lisa, can you conceive of any circumstances? I know everybody thinks in English Canada that the Bloc is somehow completely illegitimate to be partnered with, but can you conceive of any circumstances which would allow people to get past that and allow some kind of informal coalition to include at least the tacit support of the Bloc, which might get us out of the kind of thing we're talking about here today?
I don't think that we can imagine a scenario where it's formalized in any way. I think that, you know, December of 2008 showed us that very clearly, that it's simply unacceptable, even when they're not formal partners in the coalition with seats in cabinet and so on, it's still seen as being illegitimate. So I think the closest we can get to that are the kind of tacit arrangements that we see where parties in government court the support of the bloc sort of vote by vote in order to stay alive. I think that's the closest we're going to get to it. I don't think the bloc is ever going to be considered a legitimate coalition partner as long as it espouses sovereignty.
Outside of Quebec, you mean?
Outside of Quebec,
Outside of
yes,
Quebec. Tim?
of course.
Well, I actually think the country missed an opportunity that I think was fundamentally good for the country in bringing the bloc into it, and now been created as, now it's illegitimate by virtue of the way it was attacked when it was considered. But I actually think one of the things the bloc has an advantage of that no other party has, it never has to be responsible and accountable for any position it takes because it's always in opposition. It never has to defend anything. It can promise everything to everyone and does that in every riding it fights in Quebec. If it actually was in a coalition and had to buy into a governing structure for a couple of years, suddenly they'd have to be out in those ridings saying, well, yeah, actually, we're voting for that. And it would be, I actually think that notion, it's kind of interesting idea of the bloc supporting a national government and allowing it to survive and thrive and do good things. And secondly, to create the opportunity for those people to have to defend something, I actually think that might have been, it's a way, to your point, Theo, I agree that within, the best way is to bridge those differences within the party. And in an odd sort of way, that coalition might have created that opportunity and been a great thing for this country in the long term.
Can that happen under the current first-past-the-post system?
Yeah, I think it can.
We don't need a new political system for that to take place.
I think, when they're obligated to defend something, suddenly they can't get easy votes. And they'll have to, all those people who vote for them because they think they get everything they need out of a Bloc Québécois member, which they do. And suddenly they realize, hey, I can't get what I want because when they're part of the governing system, they can't deliver everything they say they're delivering. I actually think that would have been a good thing in the long term for the health of our system because it would have created opportunities for either Conservatives or Liberals to win some of those seats.
Right. You want to follow?
Well, there's that adage that says the way to diffuse a revolution is to give the revolutionaries power, and they actually have to go and do something. I think what Tim is saying is you have these people who are perpetual revolutionaries because nobody's ever going to actually give them power, and there really isn't any consequence to what they do. I assume, I don't want to get in trouble again, I assume you're going to go to discussing the first-past-the-post system and throw it back to the host. How about?
Did you see how I raised it with him, though?
No,
Did you see what I did?
No, sweet.
I said, do we need the current system in order to make that happen?
Yeah.
Which kind of opens the door to the discussion about PR. You see what I was doing there?
No, it's a pro at work. Well,
Watch and learn, my friend.
Well, yeah.
Well, that takes me to Jim, because that's what you guys are all about.
Yes, and it's not just the Green Party. I'm a member of Fair Vote Canada on their National Advisory Board. And we want to see people of every political stripe want to see their votes count. If you're a Conservative in Toronto, 400,000 votes are entirely wasted. They don't elect a single member. So why should you even bother going to the polls if you're a Conservative here? If you're a Liberal in Alberta, the Green Party's ahead of the Liberals in Alberta quite often. Why should you bother being politically engaged? And so the system we have actually has huge disincentives for people to get involved.
But that would be the end of big tent politics.
Well, it would be a part of the end. I mean, the Liberal Party and Conservatives would continue to be large parties. If you look to Germany, there are, the CDU and the SPD are large parties. So you have a couple of large parties, but they need coalition partners. And on the issue of the bloc, I just want to say Quebec brings some incredible values to Canada. If you look at the values in Quebec, completely against the war in Iraq, completely against the war in Afghanistan, radically pro-choice, concerned about the environment and the strongest province around those issues. Those are values that I, as a Green, am very excited about. And so I could see the Bloc as a coalition partner after the election, not before, but after an election, because the social values they represent are part of what makes me excited to be a Canadian. And so I feel we need to have Quebec in Canada because it flavors the whole rest of the country.
But a minute and a half to go, Lisa. Can I just get you on, if we did go to some kind of more proportional representation kind of a system, that would be the death knell for what we've been talking about today, namely big tent politics, and would that be a bad thing?
Well, I think the thing is that what we're really talking about here isn't so much tents as brokerage, right? The kind of deal making that has to be done in order to bring together disparate interests in a great big country where people don't agree about things and have different economic interests. But so the question then with the electoral system is, do we want this to happen inside one political party, which is the case when you've got single member plurality, or do we want it to take place between parties after the election has been held, which is the case when you have coalition politics? I think like a lot of political scientists, I'm kind of a fan of PR, but it would just give me something to study for the next 10 years.
That's 2 votes for PR on this program. You guys?
No.
No?
I understand. If I were with the Green Party, I would want it. And so I don't fault you for it in the
It's the only way
slightest.
to get a seat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said it, but not me. But frankly, it is. So I understand it. From a practical perspective, though, I mean, whether a person's vote matters or not, it is their opportunity to make their voice heard. So to your question to the professor about whether you'd have the coalitions before or after, I would say after if necessary. But by all means, I think each person should vote for the person they think is the best person to represent them, whether they're going to win or lose. And look, speaking as someone who's voted for the Conservatives in Toronto, believe me, I understand the phenomenon you described, but I get it.
Waiting for the big breakthrough. Haven't won a seat here since 1988.
We could still surprise you.
Federally or provincially. Thanks a lot, everybody, for partaking in our little tent here at the agenda today. Starting Lisa Young, University of Calgary, out in Alberta. Thanks so much, Lisa, for being on the program today. Jim Harris, the former leader of the Green Party. Nice to have you in our studio. Tim Murphy, Theo Caldwell on the other side of the table. Appreciate it, everybody.
Thank you.